Greetings. This is Chapter 7, National Origin Discrimination. We touched on the issues of national origin a little bit because oftentimes charges of race and color overlap with race and color discrimination, overlap with national origin discrimination. Typically, people from equatorial countries tend to have darker skin tones and are more likely to be African American or Latinx. So we want to see how they're similar, but also how they differentiate from race and color, because it is a little bit different, because not everybody who is from equatorial nations are necessarily dark-skinned colors. Our first learning objective is to describe the impact and implications of the changing demographics on the American workforce. As we know, given immigration issues and given people who are here in the United States already, who are having children and they are entering the American workforce, we're seeing a larger population of people from different countries that are helping grow the American workforce. And so it is becoming more diverse. It isn't just white males who are overtaking and dominating the American workforce. And in fact, there are fewer and fewer percentage-wise white Americans in the workforce. That number, that percentage is shrinking. So how do we address these issues, right? It's not like there's less jobs available. It just means that as more jobs are being created, we are finding that there's growing diversity amongst the people in the workforce. And so the presumption oftentimes is that people say, oh, immigrants are taking our jobs. Immigrants are taking jobs. They're not necessarily taking a job that you're qualified for. And certainly no one is going to hire somebody who's unqualified for a job over somebody who's qualified. And so obviously there's all sorts of entanglements around issues and concerns about immigration and naturalization. But we do see with work visas and green cards and immigration of people who came here years ago, who are a growing population here in the United States, we are seeing much more diversity in the demographic makeup of our workforce. Number 2, define the prima facie case for national origin discrimination under Title VII. So we'll be clear about exactly what it means to have discrimination based on national origin. We're going to, number 3, explain the legal status surrounding English-only policies in the workplace. There are some limitations in when English-only policies can be implemented, and we'll talk about those in a bit. The fourth learning goal is to describe a claim for harassment based on national origin and discuss how it might be different from one based on other protected classes. And this is where we'll start to get into what does it mean to have harassment based on national origin versus harassment based on race or sex or things like that. Number 5, identify the difference between citizenship and national origin. Because you can be a citizen of the United States, but your national origin might be from another country. Initially, you can become a citizen through getting visas and certainly going through the citizenship process. Explain the extent of protection under the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And so that's the I-9 form and why we have the I-9 form in place, what is its purpose, and how can we use it, and what are some of the assumptions behind it. So the statutory basis for national origin discrimination is as follows. It's in Exhibit 7.1 if you want to refer to it. And these statutes include Section 703A of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. And you can go to the EEOC's enforcement guidance on national origin discrimination for more specific elements that direct us and guide us in how we handle claims of national origin discrimination. The Immigration and Reform and Control Act, I remember being in the workforce when that was implemented, and we had to go back and retroactively get an I-9 form from all of the employees that we had working for us in the company to verify whether or not they were eligible for working in the United States. So it was a complex process, but once it was implemented, right, the retroactive work was really hard in 86, 87. But once it was implemented, we were in a much better place to be able to do that work. So I like this notion of, is the United States a melting pot, a stew, or a salad bowl of all sorts of different cultures? I like the idea of mosaics because if you look at the individual pieces in a mosaic, they are unique. They have their own vibrancy, their own unique contributions to the big picture. And then you look at the whole mosaic drawing as an entity in and of itself, and you find incredible beauty and the rhythm and the integration of the way things sort of work together. I don't like the idea of a stew because it doesn't seem like it's purposeful, like everything just gets dumped into a pot. I don't like the idea of a melting pot either because it means we're all melting into one lump as one thing rather than having unique elements. Salad bowl kind of comes close, but it gets at those issues. Fundamentally, your perspective on the United States, whether you think it is a melting pot or a mosaic or a salad bowl or a stew, really informs the way you think about immigration and the issues around immigration. So it's sort of an interesting perspective. So national origin is included in the Title VII's list of protected classes, as we talked about in the previous slide. It's section 703A of Title VII. And it seeks to ensure that employers do not make employment decisions based on employees' or applicants' country of origin. Now, the decision should be made, number one, are they qualified to do the job? And number two, are they eligible to do the job? And so eligibility is what we're talking about when we're thinking about um, using the I-9 form and verifying that, yes, they are eligible to work here in the United States, regardless of where they come from, right? And then, of course, it's about, can they do the job? Do they have the knowledge, skills, and abilities, the KSAs, to be able to adequately perform the position and to be able to get the job? So we want to make sure that we're not looking at where someone comes from, whether or not they have an accent or whether or not they may have lived for a while in another country. I have a very good friend who's been a friend of mine since sixth grade, who is technically a U.S. citizen. She was born in the United States. She was born in Florida, but very shortly after living in the United States and being born here, she moved to Puerto Rico. And she lived in Puerto Rico until she was about 9 or 10. So she developed a very heavy Spanish accent. Yet, she's absolutely a U.S. citizen, and if anybody didn't know that, they might question her her based on her country of origin and perhaps discriminating against her because of that. So it's an important distinction. Don't always assume that we understand whether or not someone's a citizen based on the fact that they may have an accent. We do have a long tradition of bias against recent immigrants. I don't know why that occurs, but there's always the sense of those of us who are here now are okay, but you're an immigrant. But let's be real, right? The only people who are native to the United States are the Native Americans, right? They are the ones who have been here since before the Mayflower landed, before Jamestown was founded, before anybody was in the Caribbean. There were already Native people living here. We're all immigrants. We've all come here. Even if it was 200 or 300 years ago, we are all immigrants and don't necessarily have a stake to this country any more so than the Native Americans do, or certainly less so than the Native Americans. Let me put it that way. So we don't get to lord it over people who are newly immigrating here, that somehow we have greater rights to being here in the United States than do they. Again, the United States wasn't founded on being anything other than a nation that allowed people to migrate here and to populate the location. And so we are all immigrants. And given that, this perpetual problem of bias against the most recent wave of immigrants that are coming into this country is more about being insular and isolated from others and feeling, again, the sense of white supremacy, that somehow this country is supposed to just be white and that's it. And that's, of course, not the case. There's the aspirational text on the Statue of Liberty, which doesn't have any statutory value, but it does represent our values. It's a, give me, you're tired, you're hungry, you're poor, the people yearning to be free, et cetera, et cetera. I don't have that off the top of my head clearly, but again, this whole notion that, you know, we are supposed to be here for people who are looking for new opportunities. That's the beacon of the United States, and what we've stood for is certainly, culturally, we've stood for that. That we welcome immigrants, and we talk about the immigrations in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and people coming here, and then since then, right, this flow of people coming to the United States. People come here for jobs and opportunities, and if there are more people to do jobs, then we need more industry, more services, more jobs available for people to be here. It's not, there's not a static number of jobs available. We can create more jobs if we want to, grow industries, develop new industries, do all this sort of stuff. And so I think the Statue of Liberty statement is important and inspirational, and it's a cultural guide for us, but just be aware that it is not statutorily defined in any way. There are recent claims of national origin discrimination that overlap with issues of race, but there are distinct issues of what it means for immigrants versus others, in the context of figuring out discrimination. As I noted in the learning goals, the workforce is changing its makeup very dramatically. In 2017, there were 44 million immigrants coming to the United States. That represented about 14% of our population. Of that, 27% were Asian, 25% were Mexican, 25% from other Latin American areas, 13% from Europe and Canada, 17% and they represent 70% of the total workforce. Higher workforce population participation is for men versus women. Oftentimes immigrants come to the country, women are responsible for being home or taking on the responsibility for being home and raising the kids while the men go out and work. And so we see for immigrant populations less women out there in the workforce. Mostly our immigrant populations are men. There's a substantial wage gap at lower education levels. So even those who are lower educated are still making less as immigrants than they are if they were equally as educated or equally as uneducated as white Americans are. This is attenuated as degrees go higher. So we start to find that as people have higher level degrees, high school degrees, bachelor's degrees, masters and doctorates, we see less of a wage gap based on that. So the education tends to modify that or attenuate it, as it says. EEOC complaint volume has risen in this country, and it did peak in 2011. It seems to be stabilizing a little bit more, but we may see some changes over the next few years as the ramifications from the Trump's immigration policies are going to have an impact one way or the other. So we'll see how that plays out.